Lent, of course, begins on Ash Wednesday. That's always the case, and there are, of course, famous Fat Tuesday celebrations, such as the one in New Orleans, Mardi Gras. It's also true, however, that this is the first Sunday of Lent when the majority of people really become aware of the season. If there are rituals to be adopted, they generally begin today. Some people will think about giving up something for Lent. Others think about not only giving up something and taking the money that they might have spent on that something and using it for something good. So turn a vice into a blessing. Maybe a blessing from somebody else. So here is where our journey begins. For some, it's a familiar journey. For others, it might be something a bit new. New believers that haven't walked this road before. But either way, we begin with a promise that began with a covenant. And in that it's much like Genesis 9, which we read earlier. Consider verses 13 through 15. I have placed my bow in the clouds, and it will be a symbol of the covenant between me and the earth. Flood waters will never again destroy all creatures. It was the rainbow that was to be that symbol, of course. Maybe there really is a pot of gold at the end of that rainbow when we consider the value of the promise of God that we receive, the forbearance. The sermon series for Lent this year is Rend Your Hearts, Claiming the Promise. You might notice that hearts is plural in this case. But the promise that we're talking about, this covenant promise of God, it's singular. And that's very intentional. The call to the Lenten journey is corporate. We are to bring our community together in this call. There are no excuses for not doing so. We are to be together as we rend, as we open ourselves as a whole body to the promises of God. Even in this time where we seem to be kept socially apart, though, there are ways that we can do so. But also notice that God's promise to us is a singular one. And it's not just about a rainbow in the sky, a reminder of a promise. It's God's promise to be in relationship with us. The rainbow is simply a reminder of that relationship. There are lots and lots of promises in the Bible. It's absolutely true. But I think if you read each one carefully, you'll find that every one of them comes from the same place. Each of these gifts, each of these encouragements, these things that are designed to equip us, all stem from the original and singular promise of God. This promise of presence, of ongoing relationship with one another. We hear it in the words attributed to John Wesley's on his deathbed. Best of all, God is with us. We can and will enumerate some of the manifestations of this promise throughout this sermon series. But it's important to remember it always comes back to this promise. And for the moment, let's focus on that simple and profound truth. God is with us, and we are not alone. Even when we feel out, cut off from one another by the pandemic and the lockdown, even when we hear things like mask wearing is going to go on long beyond inoculation. But we know because God is with us, even in the worst of our times, even in the most depressing moments of our lives, we're not alone. We're not expected to face these trials and tribulations without the presence of God in our life. The symbol of the rainbow is familiar not only to the Christian faith, but also to the Jews, to whom the promise was first made. We are all, after all, inheritors, those who've been grafted to the promise of God. From Abraham to Isaac to Moses, to David, and on and on and on. And Matthew's gospel reminds us of the lineage of Jesus, that he came fully Jewish, fully human, and fully divine. The rainbow appears and God makes a promise never to destroy the world and its inhabitants by flood again. Some of us might think, well, so a flood will not destroy the whole world in a single bound. But you know, that doesn't say much about geographically centric floods. Those could certainly happen, and they certainly have. Or it doesn't say anything about all the other ways the world could suffer the wrath of humankind. I listened to an analysis of all the space debris that's in our area, the meteors, the comets, you name it, and how a single piece of debris impacting the Earth at just that moment could cause even a small shift in the magnetic poles, not alone forgetting what it means to have an event like Mount St. Helens where horrendous amounts of debris were put into the air. Just like Pompeii, a city disappeared underneath the ash. Not what I first thought when I thought of a shift in the magnetic pole. I kind of thought about the Earth turning over, because it's been said that at least once in the existence of the Earth, what was north was south, and what was south was north. You know, that's kind of a binary view, though. Like taking a magnet and just turning it over in your hand, the North Pole and the South Pole. And what are they but what we call them? But what about a small shift in the axis? What if the North Pole moved to the east or the west? Somewhat to the south, but not fully to the south. Well, you know, all the land, whether above or below the water, is on a plate. And those plates are constantly in motion, constantly changing the topography of the world in many ways. We heard it in the news just this week. Another giant seismic event in Japan. Enough so that all of the automotive manufacturing in Japan is essentially shut down, not to mention probably a lot of other industries. Now think about these plates, things that have been in motion. Think about a change in the axis and how that might change the motion. And change about the laws of physics that we've had even since Sir Isaac Newton. That law of physics that says objects in motion tend to stay in motion. We all know what happens when you take a gyroscope and bend it a little bit when it's in motion. It resists, but then motion continues. We have that continued motion, but the change in the axis has an impact on the direction of that motion. And in some places, this intersection that happens in a new way results in masses of land being pushed up, creating great mountain ranges like our Cascade Range, the Rocky Mountains. While at the same time, this interaction might cause other places, other land masses to sink. It can even cause masses to raise from within the ocean and part the seas. The entire topography of the world could change in a major way and also pretty quickly. And woe be it to the people who find themselves caught out on the places which will quickly find themselves underwater. It doesn't have to be that big, though, and that improbable. There's a lot of space junk out there, and it wouldn't take much for one big piece to hit the planet. But it doesn't have to be that much of an event. Just off of our own coast, right near the interaction of the plates off the North American continent, is called Cascadia. And when it goes, it's likely there will be a huge impact on the entire west coast of the United States. It's happened before, and many scientists think that we're somewhere close to the window in which it could happen again. Of course, they could be entirely off. They say it's about a 700,000 year cycle. Well, there's pretty big variance on that, so it's been about 700,000 years since it happened, so it could happen anytime, but it could also wait for quite a while. We just don't know. We don't know if any of us here in this place will live long enough to see it. And maybe in our heart of hearts, we actually hope that we won't. You know, if it did, everything between the coast and I-5 is likely to be lower, underwater. And the swath of land that it takes with it gets bigger the further south you go. But even if it is an event like a meteor that's suspected of wiping out all the dinosaurs, there are always great risks to life on a huge scale. And we simply don't know when they'll come. And none of what we read today mentions the destructive potential, not only of natural cycles in the earth, but the destructive potentials of our own making. All three of us in this room that are part of bringing this message today grew up with silly things like duck and cover. That was all about the potential for somebody getting stupid with a nuclear device. All of us dying while hiding, with our tails in the air. There's so many other things that we've done and that we continue to do that are divisive, that cause problems for our planet. We could go on and on if we don't mind getting a bit morose, but none of that's really the point. What is that we need to dig a little deeper so that we can hear the profound and revolutionary things that takes place in this text. What does all this really say about the nature of God and of God's relationship with humanity? If we travel back to the creation story, even though it isn't really expected in our time to be a scientific explanation of all of the events that took place, we know that there was water and that life as we know it didn't exist. In Star Trek: The Next Generation, they referred to what was there as maybe more like primordial ooze. The early essence of life before creation. And there was, for all practical purposes, as we know it today, nothing. No real life. No animals. No humans. And in today's story, we're emerging from a time in which there had been a great reset. One of biblical proportions. And you know that the flood story isn't unique to the people of God. It was a big deal for everyone when the ark, the remains of the ark, had been located. The story of Noah is a story about a creator who's become dissatisfied with creation. Nearly all life on earth had been ended with a wave of a hand, like wiping all the armies off the board in a giant game of Risk. When you read the story from beginning to end, life might seem a little less valuable, maybe meaningless, empty in ancient times. But here in our text today, in chapter 9, we see a change. We see that everything changed. God the Creator, by His word, became God the Protector. On so many occasions, we've talked about how water represents chaos. Maybe it even is chaos in many senses. But in the text, God says once and for all that a choice is being made to stand between creation and chaos, between meaninglessness and a life of community and purpose. God chose, and not only chose, but then committed to that choice, to stand with what had been created from nothing, from that primordial ooze. And yes, we talked about the fact that this is only one method amongst a quiver of possibilities. But listen to the words carefully. I have set my bow in the clouds. Yes, when we read that, we see in our mind's eye the symbol of the rainbow and even take comfort in it. But look a bit deeper. Beyond the words that are used and the symbolism applied to them, God says, I set my bow in the clouds. God has set what was a common weapon of war in that time aside. And it became the symbol of a great promise, visible for all to look at. Maybe we hear later that we'll turn our bows into plowshares. God set aside a weapon of destruction, and in its place has promised a permanent shift from that of warrior God to protector God. You know, we freely acknowledge that biblical stories like this one and many others can be difficult. I also read this week about the discovery of the remains of Lot's wife, the pillar of salt. The one who looked back on Sodom and Gomorrah when she had been told to keep moving forward and don't look back. This is thought to bring proof to yet another biblical story. Not only the ark's been found, but the symbol of moving forward, moving with God, away from a life of sin. And of course, it was a difficult story of God, literally at wit's end with creation. Show me just one righteous. And no, they couldn't find any. From the moment with the tree in the garden, the fallen nature of humanity was creating complications, difficulties. The God of love has paid the price over and over and over for our volitionality, for our ability to choose. But that volitionality has to exist, because without it, there is no choice to love one another. It's simply a matter of obligation. In giving us choice, God has to let there be the potential for chaos, for making the wrong choice and all the ripples that come from that, for a return to nothingness from which everything was created. Sodom and Gomorrah, the ark, the great flood, they represent for us today God's efforts to bring things back to the garden, back into relationship. But time and again, humankind just had no interest in that. At the end of today's text leaves us with the realization God wants us to live lives in relationship, to live lives in the presence of God's grace and God's love. But that no matter what, that no act of God, no matter how fully encompassing, will fill that gap. The gap created in the relationship between God and man. So God sets aside an attitude of insistence, and in its place offers an attitude of relationship. Because love demands that choice. And that choice is our journey to make, yours and mine, all of ours. God promises to reorient all of creation to that of a relationship between God and God's people. So this sign of the rainbow that we talk about when we talk about the story of the ark, it carries a great significance for us. Maybe more than we've ever thought about. Realize that we have a sign that we can count on, that readily points to God's presence in our lives, to God's grace in our lives, and to the hope given that will replace all of our fears. We know God's hand is always extended, that each of us might grab hold. Just like Jesus in the desert. that God is there to protect us. God is there to take care of us. And we have a new challenge because of this. We need to consider how each of us will become a sign of God's active presence in our own lives. We need to present to the world what seems quite adversarial at times. We need to make a case for how God is working among us. So our realization this week is not only that there's a visible sign there, one that we understand, one that we can point to, but that also that we the church and its people of faith, have also become a sign, not only for one another, but for those who have yet to see. When we look around ourselves, when we see a world plagued by pandemic, when we see things that seem absolutely senseless to us, when we see signs of animosity and adversaries everywhere we look, we can look back and consider God's choice to move humanity beyond chaos and calamity. We know this because of what our gospel text reminds us. That Jesus was God's Son in whom he was well pleased. That he had come down to be with us, to live with us, and to be for us the living proof of God in our lives and in our hearts. The living proof that God is and continues to be with us. The sign of the rainbow personified. Jesus incarnate. And he's a sign that God is not only present, but also that he's here as an advocate and not as an adversary. And that he's actively, purposefully working with us. Part of the work ahead of each of us this Lenten season is to assess how well we are doing in following in that example and ourselves being that sign. The rending of our collective hearts is the confession that we are sometimes more of an adversary to the work of God than an advocate. Whether our thoughts are individual and we consider our service to God and to humankind from a personal perspective, or corporately, as is also needed, to examine the quality of our service as a community of faith. Either way, it's our time to examine our hearts, our minds, our souls, and our strength, and to once again declare, this is our sign. Amen.